What happens when the perfect crime becomes a lethal trap? He thought taking his greatest rival's daughter would bring an empire to its knees. But as the ransom clock ticked down, he discovered a terrifying truth. He hadn't abducted a helpless princess. He had invited the devil inside his walls. The cold November wind, ripping off Lake Michigan, felt like shattered glass against Dominic Rossi's face. He stood in the shadows of an alley off East Monroe Street, the collar of his wool overcoat turned up against the driving rain. Across the street, the Palmer House Hilton glowed like a beacon of inaccessible wealth, its revolving brass doors filtering the city's elite into a charity gala that was nothing more than a front for money laundering. Dominic checked his platinum Daytona watch. 10:14 p.m. The timeline was everything. He pressed 2 fingers to his earpiece. Status Leo. Cameras in the south corridor are looped. Leo's voice crackled, steady and low. Target is moving toward the powder room on the mezzanine. She's alone. 2 of her father's security detail are stationed at the base of the stairs, but they're distracted by the open bar. You have a 3-minute window. Dom, I'm moving, Dominic replied, stepping out of the alley. Tonight was about one thing: leverage. For 3 years, Richard Hastings had been slowly dismantling the Rossi syndicate. Hastings wasn't a traditional mobster. He was worse. He was a billionaire real estate developer who bought judges, owned city councilmen, and used the police force as his personal hit squad. 6 months ago, Hastings had ordered the seizure of Dominic's legitimate shipping warehouses at the docks, followed by a mysterious fire that claimed the life of Dominic's closest uncle. The police ruled it an accident. Dominic knew it was an execution. Hastings was untouchable in the light of day. But he had one known weakness: his 24-year-old daughter, Clara. Dominic slipped through the hotel's service entrance, flashing a forged catering badge to the bored security guard who barely glanced up from his phone. Moving with predatory grace, Dominic navigated the labyrinth of stainless steel kitchens and service elevators until he reached the mezzanine level. He waited in the alcove just outside the women's restroom. The bass from the ballroom's jazz band thumped through the carpeted floor. A moment later, the heavy oak door opened. Clara Hastings stepped out. She was breathtaking, wrapped in a deep emerald silk dress that clung to her frame, her dark hair pinned up in an elegant, complex twist. To the rest of the world, she was a wealthy socialite, a board member of her father's philanthropic foundations, a girl who spent her weekends in the Hamptons and her winters in Gstaad. To Dominic, she was the key to tearing Richard Hastings' empire down to the studs. As she walked past the alcove, Dominic moved. He was fast a phantom in a tailored suit. One hand clamped firmly over her mouth, muffling her gasp, while his other arm locked around her waist, pulling her backward into the shadows of the service corridor. She fought instantly, a wild, thrashing panic. Her stiletto heel caught Dominic's shin, but he absorbed the pain without a flinch. "Do not scream," Dominic whispered, his voice a low, gravelly threat against her ear. "Nod, if you understand." Clara went rigid. Her chest heaved against his arm, her eyes wide with terror as she stared at the dark service stairwell ahead. Slowly, she nodded. Dominic replaced his hand with a strip of heavy-duty duct tape, securing it over her mouth. He swiftly bound her wrist with industrial zip ties. He didn't enjoy this, the terror of a civilian, but in his world, collateral damage was an accepted currency. He draped a heavy catering coat over her shoulders to conceal the bindings, and forced her down the concrete stairs. Keep moving. He commanded, his grip tight on her arm. They reached the underground loading dock exactly at 10:17 p.m. A black armored Escalade idled with its headlights off. Leo threw the side door open. Dominic shoved Clara into the back seat and climbed in after her, pulling the door shut just as the heavy tires squealed against the damp concrete. "Clear," Leo called out from the driver's seat, steering the massive vehicle toward Lower Wacker Drive, plunging them into the subterranean darkness beneath the city. In the back of the SUV, the atmosphere was suffocating. Clara was pressed against the far door, her knees pulled tight to her chest. Mascara stained her cheeks, mixing with tears that flowed freely over the silver duct tape. She looked small, broken, and utterly terrified. Dominic watched her from the opposite side of the cabin, feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. It was done. The untouchable Richard Hastings was about to receive a phone call that would shatter his world. "Take the tape off," Dominic ordered as they merged onto the Kennedy Expressway, leaving the city lights behind. He leaned over and gripped the edge of the tape, ripping it off her mouth. In one swift motion, Clara gasped, taking in ragged, desperate breaths. She squeezed her eyes shut, trembling violently. "Who are you?" She choked out, her voice barely a whisper, thick with fear. "If my father, your father, is exactly why you're here, Clara," Dominic interrupted smoothly, leaning back into the leather seats. "My name is Dominic Rossi. I imagine my surname means something to you." Clara's breath hitched. She opened her eyes, staring at him through the dim streetlights passing over the tinted windows. "Rossi," she breathed, shrinking further back. You're the one he warned me about. Good. Then you know I don't bluff," Dominic said coldly. "You aren't going to be harmed, provided Richard follows my instructions. But make no mistake, Clara. You belong to me now. You are the price of your father's sins." Clara lowered her head, sobbing quietly into her bound hands. Dominic turned his gaze out the window, watching the rain streak the glass. It had been almost too easy. The perfect heist, the perfect leverage. But as the Escalade sped toward the industrial outskirts of Pilsen, Dominic didn't notice the subtle shift in the shadows of the back seat. He didn't see that Clara's tears had already stopped falling. And he certainly didn't see the fleeting, almost imperceptible ghost of a smile that touched the corners of her mouth. The safe house was a converted subterranean storage level beneath an abandoned textile factory on the edge of the city limits. It was virtually a fortress, 2 feet of reinforced concrete soundproofed walls and a state-of-the-art security grid running on an independent off-grid generator. Dominic had spent months preparing it for this exact scenario. Clara was seated in a plush but heavy armchair in the center of the main holding room. Dominic had cut the zip ties upon arrival, leaving her wrists red and chafed. The room was sterile, but not cruel. There was a bed in the corner, a small private washroom attached, and a table with bottled water and untouched food. It had been 4 hours since the abduction. At 2 a.m., Dominic sent the encrypted video file to Richard Hastings' private server. It was a simple 10-second clip of Clara sitting in the chair holding a newspaper from that evening, followed by a text document demanding a transfer of all controlling shares of the waterfront developments back to the Rossi syndicate, along with a full confession of the arson that killed Dominic's uncle. Dominic stood on the other side of the reinforced glass observation window, drinking black coffee. He watched Clara. She hadn't moved in an hour. She sat perfectly still, her emerald dress stark against the drab grey of the room. Her earlier panic had subsided into what Dominic assumed was a state of catatonic shock. He pressed a button on the intercom console. "You need to drink some water, Clara. Dehydration won't help you." Clara slowly lifted her head, looking directly at the two-way glass. She knew he was there. "I prefer sparkling," she said. Her voice was no longer trembling. It was flat, calm, and eerily resonant. Dominic frowned. He unlocked the heavy steel door and stepped into the room, a bottle of water in his hand. He set it on the table near her. "Still processing the reality of your situation?" he asked, crossing his arms. Clara looked at the bottle, then up at him. The terrified socialite from the SUV was gone. Her posture was perfectly straight, her hands resting calmly on her lap. Her dark eyes, which had looked so wide and panicked earlier, now held an icy, calculating depth. "I'm processing the fact that your encrypted network has a lag time of roughly 1.4 seconds, Clara said softly, tilting her head. "Which means you're bouncing the signal through an offshore proxy, likely in the Caymans, before sending it to my father. Clever, Mr. Rossi, but a little archaic." Dominic froze. The silence in the room suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. "Excuse me." Clara stood up, smoothing down the wrinkles in her silk dress. She walked slowly around the perimeter of the small room, examining the reinforced walls. "I said it's archaic. The Cayman's proxy is a known routing path for the Chicago outfits. If my father's tech team is half as good as he pays them to be, they'll trace the digital footprint back to this geographic radius within 12 hours. Dominic's hand instinctively dropped toward the concealed holster at his waist. "How do you know about my network routing?" Clara stopped and turned to him, an amused glint in her eyes. "Oh, Dominic, do you honestly think my father runs his own empire? Richard Hastings can barely operate a smartphone. He's a charismatic face, a bulldog for the cameras. He signs the papers and shakes the hands." She took a step closer to him. "Who do you think actually balances the ledgers? Who do you think orchestrated the hostile takeover of your docks?" The air in Dominic's lungs vanished. He stared at her, his mind racing to process the sheer absurdity of her words. "You're lying. You're a 24-year-old party girl. You run charity galas. Charity galas are the ultimate front for moving untaxed capital." Clara said, her voice dropping to a dangerous conspiratorial whisper. "The $50 million my father allegedly stole from you. It never went to his accounts. It was funneled through 3 shell companies in Zurich before being reinvested in municipal bonds under a trust. A trust that I control." Dominic stepped forward, grabbing her by the arms. "If you're playing a game to save your life, it's a dangerous one. I will snap your neck and mail you back to him in pieces." Clara didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his grip, her face inches from his. "I know you won't, because you're not a monster, Dominic. You're a businessman seeking justice for your uncle Marco. You want to clear the Rossi name." Dominic's blood ran cold. The public only knew his uncle as Mark. Only the inner family called him Marco. "Let go of me," Clara commanded. It wasn't a plea, it was an order. Slowly, almost involuntarily, Dominic released her. He took a step back, his hand resting on his gun, staring at her, as if she had suddenly shape-shifted. "Why are you telling me this? If you're the one pulling the strings, if you destroyed my business, why give yourself away?" "Because I needed an audience with you, Clara said simply, walking back to her chair and sitting down like a queen ascending a throne. And it's very difficult to get a private meeting with the boss of the Rossi Syndicate without raising my father's suspicions. You let me kidnap you. Dominic's voice was a low growl, anger mixing with profound disorientation. Let you? Clara laughed a sharp, crystalline sound. Dominic, I orchestrated it. Why do you think my security detail was conveniently distracted by the bar? Why do you think the cameras in the south corridor looped so easily? Your hacker Leo is good, but he's not that good. I unlocked the firewall for him an hour before the gala. Dominic's mind flashed back to the hotel, the distracted guards, the perfectly timed exit to the restroom, the ease with which she had fit into his meticulous plan. He pulled his radio from his belt. Leo, check the firewall logs from the Palmer house. Right now. Seconds ticked by in agonizing silence. Clara watched him, her expression serene. Dom. Leo's voice came back tight with panic. The firewall wasn't hacked. It was manually bypassed from an internal terminal. Someone opened the back door for us. Dominic lowered the radio. He looked at the beautiful woman sitting in his reinforced cage, realizing with a sickening drop in his stomach that the cage wasn't meant for her. You brought me here, Dominic said slowly. Why, Sami? Clara crossed her legs, leaning forward. The innocent facade was entirely stripped away, revealing a ruthless, brilliant strategist underneath. Because my father has outlived his usefulness, Clara said, her eyes darkening. He's becoming reckless, drawing too much federal attention. He plans to hand over the entire syndicate's operations to the feds next week in exchange for immunity, burning both his empire and yours to the ground. I needed a ghost to help me eliminate him. Someone with the motive, the means, and the muscle. She gestured around the concrete room. I needed you, Dominic. And now that I'm officially missing and presumed dead or hostage, I have the perfect alibi while we take my father down together. Dominic stared at the woman he thought was his pawn, realizing he was already standing on the chessboard she had designed. You're insane, Dominic breathed. I'm pragmatic, Clara corrected. Now sit down, Mr. Rossi. We have a lot of work to do before sunrise, and your offshore proxy is already bleeding our location. Dominic paced the length of the concrete floor, the rhythmic strike of his leather shoes echoing off the reinforced walls. He had spent his entire life mastering the violent, unpredictable chess match of the Chicago underworld. He knew how to read men, how to exploit their greed, and how to anticipate their betrayals. But he had never sat across the board from someone like Clara Hastings. You expect me to believe? Dominic started, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, that a 24-year-old heiress single-handedly orchestrated the downfall of the Rossi Syndicate just to create a perfect storm to murder her own father. More. Clara poured herself a glass of sparkling water, the heavy crystal clinking softly in the sterile room. She took a slow sip, her dark eyes never leaving his. I didn't murder anyone, Dominic. I merely arranged the pieces. My father ordered the hit on your uncle Marco. My father bribed Judge Thomas Gallagher to sign the seizure warrants for your docs. All I did was make sure he felt untouchable enough to actually go through with it. She set the glass down and leaned forward, the emerald silk of her dress shifting over her curves. Richard is a narcissist. He believes his own press. But lately he's become sloppy. 3 weeks ago, Special Agent Bradley Foster of the FBI's Organized Crime Division cornered him. Foster had wiretaps, offshore ledger leaks, the works. Instead of fighting, my father cut a deal. Dominic stopped pacing. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Immunity. Full immunity. Clara confirmed her expression, hardening into a mask of pure cold calculation. In exchange, he's handing over the complete operational blueprints of the Hastings Empire, and as a bonus, the geographical locations of your primary distribution hubs. He's scheduled to sign the final proffer agreement with Agent Foster tomorrow night at his private estate in Lake Forest. By midnight tomorrow, both our families will be eradicated, and Richard will be sipping martinis in witness protection. Dominic's jaw tightened. If she was telling the truth, the Rossi family had less than 24 hours before the federal government kicked down their doors. He stepped closer to her, invading her personal space. He slammed his hands down on the arms of her chair, leaning in until their faces were inches apart. And your grand plan is to use my men to storm a fortified estate crawling with private security and federal agents. Dominic sneered, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. That's a suicide mission, Clara, not a strategy. Clara didn't shrink away. Instead, she lifted her chin, her breath ghosting across his cheek. The proximity was intoxicating, a dangerous mix of adrenaline, expensive perfume, and pure raw power. It's only a suicide mission if you go in blind. She whispered, her voice dropping to a husky register that sent an unexpected jolt straight to Dominic's chest. But you won't be blind. I designed the security grid at the Lake Forest estate. I know the blind spots. I know the patrol routes. And I know that tomorrow night at exactly 10:45 p.m., the primary backup generator will undergo a forced reboot that I scheduled 3 months ago. You'll have a 4-minute window of total darkness to breach the study. Dominic stared at her, mesmerized by the sheer audacity of the woman in front of him. She was terrifying. She was brilliant. And God help him, she was the most captivating thing he had ever seen. If we do this, Dominic said, his voice dropping to a grave whisper, there is no going back. If you betray me, Clara, I will not hesitate to put a bullet in your heart. A slow, wicked smile spread across Clara's face. She reached up her manicured fingers, gently tracing the line of his jaw. The touch was light, but it burned like a brand. If I wanted you dead, Dominic, you would have choked on your coffee 30 minutes ago. We are partners now. The ghost and the muscle. The next 20 hours were a blur of frenetic, meticulous planning. The safe house transformed into a war room. Leo pulled up the architectural blueprints of the Lake Forest estate, verifying every detail Clara provided. The tension between Dominic and Clara was palpable, a heavy electric current that crackled every time they brushed shoulders over the tactical maps. By 9 p.m., the following evening, the storm Clara had predicted rolled off the lake, blanketing the affluent northern suburbs in a torrential downpour. Dominic sat in the passenger seat of a black, unarmored utility van parked a half-mile from the Hastings estate. He was dressed in matte black tactical gear, a suppressed Heckler and Coke MP5 resting across his chest. Beside him, Clara was clad in matching black, her dark hair pulled back into a tight braid. She looked entirely in her element, tapping furiously away at a ruggedized tablet that was tied directly into the estate's mainframe. Foster and his detail arrived 10 minutes ago, Clara said, her eyes reflecting the blue light of the screen. They are in the West Wing study. My father's personal guards are stationed at the perimeter, but the rain is keeping them in the gatehouses. Dominic checked his weapon, slamming a fresh magazine into the well. He looked at her, the reality of the moment settling over them. Stay in the van, Clara. If this goes sideways, Leo will drive you to the airstrip. You take the jet and vanish. Clara looked up from the tablet, her eyes locking onto his. There was no fear in her gaze, only a fierce, possessive fire. She reached out, gripping the tactical vest over his chest, pulling him slightly toward her. "You don't get to die tonight, Dominic Rossi," she said, her voice fierce and unwavering. "You belong to me now. Remember." Before Dominic could respond, she pulled him in, pressing her lips to his. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was bruising, desperate, and fueled by the intoxicating high of impending violence. It was a promise signed in gunpowder and adrenaline. Dominic kissed her back hard, his gloved hand tangling in the back of her jacket, sealing their twisted pact. When they broke apart, breathing heavily, Dominic tapped his earpiece. "Leo, initiate the blackout." At precisely 10:45 p.m., the sprawling gilded mansion of Richard Hastings plunged into absolute darkness. Dominic moved like a shadow. He and his elite four-man strike team breached the heavy oak-side doors of the West Wing, slipping through the corridors with terrifying efficiency. They wore night vision goggles, turning the pitch-black hallways into a neon-green landscape of vulnerable targets. Two of Richard's guards stepped out of the billiard room, their flashlights cutting uselessly through the dark. Dominic dispatched them silently, two muted thwips from his suppressed weapon, and the men crumpled to the thick Persian rugs. "Target room is 20 meters ahead." Leo's voice buzzed in his ear. "Power restoration in 2 minutes, Dom. Move." Dominic reached the heavy double doors of the study. He could hear the panicked voices inside Agent Foster shouting orders, Richard Hastings demanding to know what was happening. Dominic kicked the doors open, shattering the heavy brass lock. The beam of his weapon's tactical light cut through the gloom, blinding the men inside. Nobody moves. Dominic roared, his weapon trained squarely on the chest of Agent Bradley Foster, who had half-drawn his service weapon. Foster froze, recognizing the distinct disadvantage of being illuminated by a tactical laser in pitch darkness. Richard Hastings stood behind his massive mahogany desk, his face pale, a silver pen still clutched in his trembling hand. Spread across the desk were the federal proffer agreements, the documents that would have signed both their lives away. Rossi. Richard breathed, his eyes wide, with a mixture of shock and sheer terror. "How did you? You talk too much, Richard." A cool feminine voice echoed from the doorway behind Dominic. The emergency lights flickered on, casting a dim golden glow across the study. Clara stepped into the room, her black tactical gear a stark contrast to the luxurious wood-paneled walls. She walked past Dominic, her posture commanding, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of an apex predator. Richard dropped his pen, stumbling backward until he hit the floor-to-ceiling bookshelf. "Clara, my God, they told me you were taken. They told me." His voice trailed off as he processed her attire, her calm demeanor, and the way Dominic Rossi lowered his weapon just slightly in her presence. "What is this?" "This is a hostile takeover, Father," Clara said evenly. She walked to the desk, glancing down at the federal documents. She picked them up meticulously, tearing the thick stack of papers directly in half, letting the pieces flutter to the floor. Agent Foster looked between Clara and Dominic, realization dawning on his face. "You set him up." You used the FBI to corner him so you could take the throne. Agent Foster, you are trespassing on private property, Clara said, turning her icy gaze to the federal agent. I suggest you and your detail leave immediately. If you check your offshore accounts in about 10 seconds, you'll find a routing deposit of $5 million from a blind trust. Consider it a consultation fee for your time. If you stay, Mr. Rossi will kindly paint this beautiful mahogany room with your brains. Foster swallowed hard. He looked at the laser still trained on his chest, then at the shredded documents on the floor. He slowly holstered his weapon. Without a word to Richard, he backed out of the room, signaling his remaining agents to stand down and withdraw. The room fell deathly silent, save for the rain lashing against the massive windows. Richard Hastings fell to his knees, looking up at his daughter as if looking at a stranger. You destroyed me. I built this empire for you, Clara. Everything I did for our family. You did it for your ego, Clara corrected her voice, devoid of any warmth. She pulled a folded legal document from her jacket and tossed it onto the floor in front of him. Sign it. Richard looked at the paper. What is it? It's an irrevocable transfer of assets. Every holding company, every legitimate shell, every piece of waterfront property, and the deed to this estate. It transfers everything to a new holding firm. Clara stepped back, standing shoulder to shoulder with Dominic. A firm co-owned by myself and Mr. Rossi. Dominic looked at her, his heart pounding a heavy, relentless rhythm against his ribs. This was the checkmate. She hadn't just saved the Rossi syndicate. She had merged their empires. She had built a kingdom in the shadows, and she was crowning him her king. Defeated, broken, and realizing he had no moves left, Richard Hastings picked up his silver pen with a shaking hand and signed his empire away. Get him out of my sight, Clara ordered softly. Dominic nodded to his men. They hauled a weeping Richard to his feet, dragging him out into the stormy night, destined for a quiet, untraceable exile. Alone in the study, the heavy silence returned. Dominic holstered his weapon. He looked at the empire laid out before them, then at the woman who had orchestrated it all with the precision of a maestro. Clara turned to him, the coldness in her eyes melting into something heated, dangerous, and entirely consuming. We have Chicago now, Dominic, she whispered. Dominic closed the distance between them, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her flush against his armored chest. He looked down into the eyes of his enemy's daughter, the woman who had kidnapped him into her world of brilliant, beautiful chaos. No Clara. Dominic murmured, his lips brushing hers as he claimed the true prize of the night. You have Chicago. I just have you. Did this dark, twisted mafia romance keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved the dangerous power play and shocking twists between Clara and Dominic, hit that like button and share this story with your fellow drama addicts. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, real-life inspired tales of betrayal, love, and deadly secrets. What would you do in Dominic's shoes? Drop a comment below.